Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people that I've connected with in the world of arts and entertainment over the years. And today we're very glad to have with us bass player, producer, all-around great guy, Alec Fraser. Welcome to the show, Alec.
Tommy, I like the great guy part. That's really kind of you. Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate you asking me on your show.
Well, you and your musical accomplishments are just as warranted for an interview as anybody, really. So, I understand that you came to Canada at a very young age, immigrated here from Scotland in 1967 as a wee lad. From there, how did you get started in music?
Well, I actually started in music as far as like playing when I was in Glasgow when I was a kid. I came here at 11 years old, so kicking and screaming. I didn't want to come here. I mean, any immigrant kid doesn't want to leave where they are, pretty much, but unless you're being bombed or something. We came to Toronto, and pretty much that was where we stayed. Now, when we first got here, I more or less took guitar seriously when I arrived because I was babysitting my two younger brothers while my parents were basically going out all the time, discovering, their new country and everything. So I got the job of being the oldest, staying home. So I just, so the time I was about maybe 14 years old, I just was living in a room I created underneath the stairs, kind of like Harry Potter in a way, but I had my record player in there and my guitar, and I sat down and I would just play along with all sorts of great music that was happening in that period from 67 to 70 more or less. And I learned fairly fast, and I found a few friends then at school who were playing too. So we put our little bands together. My first band was actually spelt Armageddon, but we thought it was Armageddon because we were so young. And when we went to play the church picnic, I went up to the mic and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are Armageddon," because nobody looked up the spelling or the pronunciation of the spelling. It was a guitar player that found it, and the priest walks up and goes, "That's Armageddon." So I was like, but that was my first band. We were writing our own songs too then, which was quite. We had songs like one title was "Flying Fuzz." What was the other one? I had Stratus Nimbus. And it was fairly clever. There were instrumentals. There was no lyrics to them. And we weren't really, smart enough to be writing our own lyrics at that time. But anyway, it started out there. And it was the rock music at the time. I mean, back in Scotland, I had a vocal group when we were, about 7 or 8 years old. We called ourselves the Beatles. And we didn't have instruments. We made the sounds with our mouths. And the drummer had a pair of rulers in his hand. And, we'd sing we knew all the lyrics to all the Beatles songs. So that was really my first sort of band. But I came from a country and Western background through, like, my father. Like, I'm talking about the old country stuff, right? And he really loved it. He was like a jazz musician that left jazz and went to country and loved it. And so I had this the Scottish and Irish roots of the songs that we had back home. And then I had the country stuff as well. And then all of a sudden this explosion of rock and roll, in the hippie days and all the stuff that came up in the 70s to 75, which is kind of my favorite period in rock. My tastes were really eclectic even as a kid. So I had, I was getting it from all different directions. Like when I'd be listening to Black Sabbath and then I'd be listening to Harry Hibbs in the morning on my way to school, So it was like one of those, I was a bit of a freak to my other friends, Hey, this is one of those long-winded answers. I hope you brought your knitting with you.
Yeah, well, you're certainly versatile, and it comes through in the music that you've been making recently. I've watched a lot of the things you're doing, and yeah, you really do have a diverse style, and now I see why. It kind of reminds me when I was a kid listening to AM radio in Canada. You'd hear 1 minute, you'd hear the Beatles, and then it would be Led Zeppelin, and then it would be Tammy Wynette right after, So
yeah, well, there was a different time back then,
it sure was.
And there's still some of that left. Like I remember, going. I don't know if it still exists in Austin, but when I was in Austin, Texas, they would be playing, Jimi Hendrix 1 minute and on the AM station, and then they'd have like Johnny Cash the next, and it was like, it reminded me of that time period you're talking about when, of course, the DJs had a lot more control, and I guess that even the program directors of the stations had more control over, in mainstream radio, I'm talking about. They had more control over what they wanted to play, and they can make or break acts, like they nowadays, they do surveys on what people like, and you get the same songs all the time everywhere. I mean, but it doesn't do much for the independent artists. We're more relying on people like you and a lot of the independent internet radio and that kind of thing, and college radio as well. But that was more like the way it used to be, and there were great times. I mean, like you said, listening to the radio back then was a very eclectic experience.
It certainly was. When you talk about how we used to be able to get music played, it wasn't that long ago, probably about 11 or 12 years ago, I walked into a radio station up in North Bay, Ontario, handed them a CD and said, would you have a listen? Next thing you know, I'm in rotation on their family radio stations. And all these years later, I think it was around 2015, I tried to get in that same door. And now they are a corporate-owned entity, and their program director is somewhere in BC and doesn't take calls.
Yeah, well, welcome to the modern age. I mean, that's pretty much the way sooner or later that does happen across the board in all sorts of formats. I mean, I'm one of the biggest fans of radio. I mean, when I was a kid, it was all I did, like that and playing records, like LPs and that and singles. I loved it. I mean, the first radio stations I used to listen to in Scotland, one was Radio Scotland, and it was a pirate radio station in a boat outside the 300-mile limit at the time. They played everything from, like all the American stuff, which is what we wanted to hear. We already had the British stuff, right? So, but even back then, BBC wasn't even playing the Beatles or the Stones or anything like that. They eventually had to come on board because of the popularity, but we got a lot of our music from that. And then my uncles as well, they were in the Merchant Navy. I had 7 of them who would bring back the 78s and 45s and LPs from their travels across, even reel-to-reel tapings of the radio stations in Nashville or New Orleans and places like that. Like in California, they'd come back and we'd sit around and listen to American radio on these the old Grundig reel-to-reel tape recorder. Those times for radio. Well, the other one was Radio Luxembourg, which was a lot more famous. These stations were doing a real service to people, even in the countries of Europe and like in Britain as well. Like, it took a while for them to come around. And you can imagine what it was like for people in the third world countries who never got exposed to any of that. But they are now, and they're not getting exposed to it through radio necessarily. They're getting exposed to it through social media, like TikTok especially. That's the bypass highway.
Yeah, I talked to Alexander Meyer a while ago, and Alex.
I listened to that. Yeah. He's a very informative guy, and he's seen it all.
Well, he said that TikTok is the new platform. If he says it, it must be true. I wanted to just take a minute or two to talk about some of the awesome musicians that you've played with over the years. You talk about, listening to all that golden age music, and then sooner or later, you were destined to play with some of those artists like Bo Diddley and the Drifters, for example, Benny King. I know you got into music at a young age, but how did you break through to the point where you were playing with some of these people and producing people like David Wilcox, etc.?
I did record him for a Miles Goodwin record because I helped Miles out on a track or two, I think it was. And I got David into a studio here. No, I played with David for a couple of years, 82 and 83. We used to play London all the time. I mean, it was a regular stop for us. We'd be there for, whole weeks at a time, or at least, a few days anyway. Yeah, so I got to play with David. How that came about was, and Jeff Healy and that, it's one of those things, but just by chance things sort of happen. So I had made a decision back very early that I didn't want to be a singer-songwriter artist on my own. I didn't have much interest in writing songs. So even though I did write them occasionally. So what I did was I became a bass player to a lot of the really great artists who were doing that. Like, and David happened to be one of them. Now, I saw David when I was about maybe 20 years old or something like that. Can't remember, but I saw him at the Queensbury Arms in Toronto, and he had the handlebar mustache and the long hair doing the Riverboard Gambler thing, and I just was blown away. I thought, man, I want to play with that guy. So about 5 years later, I was playing with Danny Middlebrook, who's Danny Brooks now. And Danny Middlebrook and I had a band called the Wasters. It was a great name. I loved the name. But anyway, David got up and jammed with us one night at the Hotel Isabella. And then he actually called Danny and said, would you mind if I gave your bass player a gig, if I hired him? And so Danny didn't want to lose me, but he knew that I guess he called me and says, look, I kind of don't want to do this, but I think it'll be good for you in the long run and good for myself, is what he said. You should play with David, it'll be good, but can you just teach the next bass player all my songs? So I made that agreement. I mapped out all the songs and I went on to play with David. And that was a wild experience because David had his record, his first album, Out of the Woods, came out 2 weeks after I joined the band. So I'm up there playing, Hot Hot Papa and Hypnotized Boogie and all that stuff. And it was 50,000 LPs it sold in 1 week because it was being played all across the country. And we were out in Calgary at the time, and we got the news. And all of a sudden, we're flying to gigs. And, we were flying anyway and that far. But things moved up very, very fast for David, and he deserved it. Because he traveled back and forth across the country and built this whole thing by himself. It wasn't anybody else his team anyway. It wasn't a record company thing or anything like that. He had done all of the work himself. And when people we were just starving for a record of his to come out. So that went really well. And then I had with Bo Diddley, I was playing with Danny Marks at the time, and we were like at the house band at the El Macombo downstairs. And when it came up, the promoter said, we want you guys to back up Bo when he comes for a couple of nights upstairs at the Elmo. And that was quite the experience. I mean, I had been a fan of Bo Diddley's for a long time, but I didn't realize how eclectic he was. I mean, he was rapping back then. I mean, he did the Bo Diddley beat, the dun 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 dun, the shaving the hair 2 bits. He did that in the show, and then he did it at the end, and then he did it for the encore, which lasted almost as long as the show. I think it was like 3.5 hours we played in a heat wave to all these college students who were just finally discovering him. That was a hell of an experience. He handed me a towel at the beginning. Everybody towels, and I didn't know what they were for, but then I realized what they were for because he never stopped. And Gene Taylor was in the band playing piano on that one too. Anyway, we had a ball on that. Now, that was sort of a one-off thing. It's like Bo was always changing his bands whenever he went from town to town. That was kind of what he did. But I was glad that I got the experience to play with him. But he was all over the map. One thing I learned about the Bo Diddley beat, when you do it, don't do it for 3 or 4 minutes. You have to do it for about 20 minutes to a half an hour in order for that one chord and that hypnotizing thing to happen. Because eventually, I was watching the audience, and what they were doing was they were just somebody who wasn't into the dancing at first. After about 15 minutes, the entire place was bopping up and down. It was a hypnotizing thing. And it came from a repetitive groove that had a formula that wouldn't stop. And it was what he did around that very simple groove. And it was a real lesson in playing that.
I watched him school a young drummer here in London one time at the London.
He did that.
I was really impressed by how much of a fluid, virtuosic guitar player he was. He was playing jazz stuff that just kind of blew me away. And the band starts to play his namesake tune, Hey Bo Diddley, and all of a sudden he stops. And he turns around and says to the drummer, get off. And he sits down and he starts playing the Bo Diddley beat. And that was one of the weirdest things I'd ever seen, but I guess he had a point to make.
Well, his point was, and he did it to Wally Cameron too, who was our drummer at the time. And what he did was he got behind the beat behind the drums, and and he says, "Look, when I did those records, I told the guys what to play, but they just ended up playing what they wanted to play because I only had about maybe 15, 20 minutes to tell them." He says, "I've got all day here. I can show you exactly what it is you want." Because Wally had learned all of the drum beats from the records. Like so that's what you do. Anyway, he got behind there and he played the beat that he says, and it was very close to what was done on the records, but it wasn't exactly what he wanted. So he played it, and then Wally played that through the whole thing. He looked at me and he goes, "Red," I had red hair at the time. He goes, "Hey, Red, you just keep doing that Willie Dixon thing." That's all he said to me. Is like, I knew how to play that. I mean, God, how hard is it anyway? And then, what he said to the guitar player was like, when he was playing the rhythm, the Bo Diddley rhythm, he goes, "Don't do that. That's me. I do that.
Yeah.
You flail around in the background. And when I'm not doing me, you can do me. But as soon as I'm back to doing me again, you stop doing me." It's like, he didn't tell Gene Taylor, the piano player, to do anything really. I mean, Gene was like, he was playing upstairs all the time. That's what you do, you tinkle around on the top. But it was a great experience. So, Bo, we got to do that. With Jeff Healey, with him, I sort of fluked that. I had a friend, my friend who I owned my recording studio with, Liquid Toronto, we put together, we actually just put it together as sort of a place to have a fort. We weren't actually, setting it out to be a commercial studio at all. But it ended up happening. It's one of those things, if you build it, they will come. But Big Ben Richardson, who plays with Big Sugar now, and he was in the Phantoms, bass player, and he played with Jeff before I did. So we had the studio, and I had recorded Jeff Healey's girlfriend at the time, Alex Pangman, jazz singer, a really good jazz singer. And we recorded the song. So then I come in, and Ben was on the road mixing Amanda Marshall or something. So I was there at the studio all the time. And on the answering machine, I get this call from Jeff saying, "Hey, guys, I just want to tell you that I just heard Alex's new 78 that they made, and I want to tell you it's the biggest pile of greatest stuff I've ever heard, even over the phone." And I thought he was not going to like it, but of course he didn't. He had a good sense of humor there. And he says, "So much so that I really want to come and record with you guys." Now, at the time, he was pretty close to Ben. I had known Jeff since he was a kid, but I never really associated with him or played with him for that matter. I met him once in Halifax in the 80s when I was down there playing Cheers, and we hung out for a little bit, but didn't really know him. So anyway, he comes into the studio, and he was another guy that had a really eclectic taste, and so we kind of hit it off. He found out it was me that did the recording. It was all live off the floor, of course, and because that's what we did there. And he came in and did some country and western stuff, which I've just given to his wife, Chris, and she's got it now, and they can do whatever they want with those recordings. I actually own the recordings, but I just gave them to them because I figured that they should have them. So anyway, we did that, and then he came out for 4 nights in a row to see me playing with 4 different bands, and each band was completely different. One was a reggae band, one was a pop band, another one was a blues band, another one was a country band. So he came out each night, and he eventually says to me, he says, "You're just like me, like in your tastes for music. Like, you're clearly a fan, and you and I should play together." And I said, "Well, my best friend Ben is playing with you." It's like, I said, "Well, I'm sure we can do that." So I didn't move into the Jeff Healey band. I just played on the Thursday nights while Ben was away on tour with Amanda Marshall. So that's kind of how it happened. And then when Ben decided to move to Austin, Texas, he basically handed me the gig. He said, "Look, why don't you use Alec?" And so Jeff was all for it. So then I started touring, going overseas, and doing all of the Jeff Healey band gigs with him. And we became very close friends. It lasted 9 or 10 years or something like that, knowing him. And I recorded all of his jazz band stuff. All the jazz was his material. Everything that he did, actually, for all the people associated with that, were all done at Liquid. And then at the end of it all, I did 2 for the Jeff Healey, what they call the Jeff Healey Blues Band, the Mess of Blues album. And then after he passed away, I did Songs from the Road, which was a live one. They were all recordings that Jeff had sanctioned and said that he liked. There was some things he left with me. He said that I should keep all of I asked him, I said, who's getting all of this material that we recorded? Like, because it was clear that he was probably not going to make it when he started chemo and all that. He said, you. And I thought it was a huge responsibility for me to actually have it. But I had sat on it for quite a while until I gave it to the family. Because I think, eventually that's what they should have it. I mean, they're in charge of the estate and everything. So anyway, I did that, and he'd left me some things saying, and his exact words were, there's a recording of See the Light that we did, and it's 11 minutes long. It was in line to be on the Mesa Blues album. We recorded it in London, England. I got this Scottish guy to come down with a mobile truck and record, and it's a killer version. I mean, it's just incredible. When Jeff heard it, he goes, because there was some sort of copyright issues with the people. I don't want to get into that, but anyway, he just says, let them fight over it when I'm gone. That's what he said. So that thing is still sitting there, but it's got the most incredible ending on it. If anybody that's ever seen Jeff knew that when he ended the show and he did See the Light, there was this big giant guitar thing he did at the end of that song that sounded like the PA was exploding. This was one of the better performances of it, and it's still sitting in the can. I don't know what they'll do with that down the line, but they may use it, they may not.
Let's hope it does actually see the light of day at some point.
Yeah, See the Light.
Yeah. I just want to talk about you for a minute. I know that you've recorded on a lot of things, you've produced a lot of people, you've won numerous awards. You're also working on new music. First of all, before we talk about the new music too much, I want the people to know where they can buy your music.
Oh, you're talking about my own?
Your own music.
Well, I made this record when the pandemic started. I started thinking, well, I got to keep playing, and this is an opportunity for me to be diverted into, doing this album that I wanted to do for 30 years. I wanted to meld my Scottish roots, my Scottish and Irish roots with North American sort of music, like, the country stuff and that, and a bit of, soul and that. I wanted to meld those two things together. It was sort of a bridge across the Atlantic sort of record that I wanted to do, because I can see the connections of both the music. I could have made a blues record, which would have been the obvious choice for someone who was marketing something, like me, who I've had successes in that, and most people know me for that. But I decided against that for now. I will do that at some point. So what I did is I made this record, and I didn't make physical copies of it. I just did an online release. So I wanted to make it available, and it's available on my website, alecfraserjr.com. So it's AlecFraserJr.com. That's where you can buy it. It's available on Spotify and all the other iTunes and all the streaming sites. It's on all of them.
Well, it's really quite good. It's really good stuff. And Alex, aside from how awesome you are as a musician, you really have a very nice, dynamic, full and rich singing voice. It's awesome stuff, really.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's all over the map, it's like but that's me. That's my personality. I'm all over the map.
Let's remind everybody the name of your new recording project that you've just released.
Yeah, it's under my own name, Alec Fraser Jr. The name of the album is On the Wings of the Wind. I got the title. It was a couple of things it just seemed like the timing of it all. I felt that everyone had been taken, swooped up, and dropped somewhere that they didn't really either want to be or didn't know they were going to land on, which was basically what the pandemic meant to me. Is like we were all lifted up and shot off somewhere and landed somewhere else. Like, what do we do now, right? But the other thing was that's what happened to me as an immigrant kid, was that I was picked up in one country and dropped off over here. And, and at the time I was pretty angry at it. It took me a long time to adjust. And that's one of the reasons why I always feel something for young immigrant kids that come to the country. I don't think people realize how vulnerable they are and what's happened to them, even if it's a good thing in the long run, because this is a fantastic country to be a part of. But it's something I relate to, so that's what On the Wings of the Wind meant to me more than anything. It just happened to tie in with the pandemic at the same time.
Well, I'll be looking to get my copy. So I know you've got things to do. You're a very busy man. You've got a lot of pans on the fire, so to speak. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, Alec, to talk to me here. And until next time, cheers.
Well, thank you, Tommy. Take care. And all your listeners out there, stay safe and be positive if we can. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Alec Fraser Jr., a man who's made a career as a journeyman musician backing up the stars and is recently introducing the world to a project that he's been waiting for decades to complete. He takes great pride in both his Irish-Scottish heritage and in his adopted homeland of Canada for many, many years. Without further ado, here is Alec Fraser Jr. with On the Wings of the Wind.
On the wings of the wind, forced places where none have ever been, where life is different but tries to be the same, and we all say the other side's to blame. Sing me a song, one of hope, and righting all the wrong. Just play me that song, the one of love, where we all get along. Get along. Should the darkness prevail, with little ships in fear that blindly sail, steer us, you beacons who are shining for our lost, from the rocks of division where we're tossed. Sing me a song, one of hope, and righting all the wrongs. Just play me that song, the one of love, where we all get along. Get along. On the wings of the wind, forced to places none have ever been, where life is different but tries to be the same, and we all say the other side's to blame. Sing me a song, one of hope, and righting all the wrongs. Just play me that song, the one of love, where we all get along.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including producing, editing, guest acquisition, etc. All rights reserved. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends was written and recorded by Tommy Solo with a little help from my friends in the night crew. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe? Until next time, cheers.